available for people to look back to visit back in the after. So feel free, of course, if you don't want to be part of the recording, of course, feel free to switch off your camera, or otherwise we're very happy to see people's faces when we do this, and particularly in this session today, because we want the session not just simply to be about talking about this particular publication that we'll be covering today, but also for it to be a spark for some conversations as well. And we know that the people that join us for these sessions are makers or academics or simply interested in the topics that we explore, and so we'd love to hear your voice. So first of all, I'm going to give an introduction to our research center before introducing John today and Knut, who are the editors of this publication. I'm going to show you in a second, but I'm also going to show it now, and it's called Staging and Recycling, Retrieving, Reflecting and Reframing the Archive. This is published by Routledge and edited by John Keefe, as I said, and Knut Ove Arntzen, who I believe should join us. I think we're still waiting. I think there might be a little delay or some technical glitch, so I hope we can join us. And so first of all, let me just talk a little bit about our research center. My name is Jacek Ludwig-Skarso. I'm the deputy director of Creature. Creature is the research center in creative arts, cultures, and engagement. It's a very interdisciplinary research center, and we work side by side with what we call our sister center called Cube, and generally Creature is specifically interested in subjects within the area of art and design, including performance, and Cube is particularly interested in areas to do with architecture, but the two of them work together side by side, and we share this calendar of talks, which we call the AAD talks, and AAD stands for Art, Architecture and Design at London Metropolitan University. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a context today. So with our school, we basically also organize a series of events that we call the AAD Books, and these are specifically about new publications in the fields that we explore within our area. So recently, for instance, we also launched a new book called Festival Cities by my colleague Margaret Gold and John Gold. So you can find, once again, all of this information and the recording of these sessions in our past events. So going back to Creature, Creature is a research center divided into 3 strands, and the strands are called, particularly in this particular case, we are looking at the strand called Public Face. The Public Face is specifically interested in performative and informative themes, and specifically also in the intersections between performance, public art, and interdisciplinary practice. So it makes complete sense, of course, to host this book launch today as part of this strand. So I'm just going to give you some information on John and Knut, who have been the editors, and I should say that not only today I'll be slightly moderating this session, but also that the true pleasure of being involved in this publication as one of the contributors. And I know that we've got other contributors today, and I hope we can hear your voice later on in the session. It's been a brilliant experience to be working as part of this publication, and John would obviously tell you more about the structure, the concept behind this anthology, but absolutely a privilege to be part of this. So let me just give you a couple more details about John and Knut's work. Let me just open the relevant page. Okay, so John Keefe is senior lecturer at the AAD School, so once again, Art, Architecture, Design at London Metropolitan University. He has worked as a lecturer in theatre and film, performance. He's a theatre director, performance dramaturg, and researcher since 1979 across the UK, Lithuania, and Germany. Research and publications are centred on the notion of dramaturgies, of the physical in theatres, of spectatorship, of ethics in theatres, of recycling, of the embodied mind that informs theatre making and viewing, On this subject and its reach, he was awarded a PhD by prior publication and commentary in 2013 under the title A Spectatorial Dramaturgy, Ethical Principles of Recycling, Habitus and Estrangement. Then we're also hopefully joined by the second editor of this book, so Knut Ove Arntzen. He's Professor of Theatre Studies at the University of Bergen, Norway. He's a freelance theatre critic and consultant to the Bergen International Theatre, as well as to the Vangio de Théâtre in Montreal. Other teaching includes the State Theatre Academy in Oslo, the Theatre Academy in Helsinki, and he's a visiting professor to the Vytautas Magnus University Kaunas. Many different publications that he's created, and he's also the co-editor to Performance Art by Baktruppen in Oslo. So thank you. Oh yes, I should also say that Knut is also currently part of the research group in Greenlandic theatre history. So we're going to start today, and we're going to loosely structure the session with starting from John's overview of our publications. Let me just show it once again. And if you go back to the, so hopefully you will have seen that on the Eventbrite, you should have seen that there's, you will have seen that there's a link to the introduction that's freely available from this publication. So I encourage, in case you haven't been able to read it, definitely to have a look. And of course, this is available in all the major bookstores. So, John, tell us about this publication. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I get so embarrassed hearing people saying what I've done and what I do. It's terrible. Anyway, that's what I do. So, firstly, I have to use notes. I'm completely useless without notes, so I'll be looking up and down. So I'm not being discourteous or anything. It's just practical. Hello. So firstly, our thanks to Wessie, Jacek, Hannah and Creature for facilitating this event. Equally first, our thanks to our colleagues, some of whom are on the screen and are joining us, who contributed to the volume, contributed to its richness of depth and breadth, which it really is. The plan is that myself, then hopefully Knut, who is clearly lost in the ether somewhere, and then Jacek will each talk briefly from their own perspectives before opening up the space for response and debate. We hope you've had the opportunity to look at the contents and introduction that was sent out with the access link. However, I do not intend giving a futile précis of the collection of the 26 pieces. That's why the contents are on the link that you have. Rather, I want to highlight some key points, to play with some key terms as part of this ongoing discussion that is both in the volume and this event and in the wider world, hopefully. So, a series of points here. The cover, which Jacek kindly held up, and I will quickly do the same. That can be seen. Yes, there we go. So the cover, an attempt to capture the idea of tracks and routes that run through the essays and the volume. The tropes of recycling, of the new, not new dialectic, of the archive that may be recovered or plundered for a recirculating or reusing or relooking. The notions of the paragon or placing beside, of circling around. These terms are taken from across the essays. They're not just mine, they're taken from across the essays. Circling around, of juxtapositions that qualify how we locate ourselves to works and theories. I would claim, therefore, we are always in relation to. However, to avoid a shallow relativism, the axioms and principles of theatres and performances that frame how we may and can place ourselves as spectators, theorists, makers. The essays, arranged in a dynamic relationship, albeit now in a printed book. So is it fixed? Yes, it is. It's out there, so it's also unfixed. I like the kind of playing with that. It's fixed up to a point. The dynamic relationship to show the possibilities of this ongoing dialogue. For example, the moment in Jacek and Jean's essay where they move from recycle, no hyphen, to recycle and upcycle, now with the hyphen, which emerges from their discussions and response to the other essays. For example, the implicit challenges across the essays to the received consensus of postmodernism, post-dramatic performativity that emerged from the collection. It's underneath the surface, I think. The spectator, the always awkward presence as nomad, poacher, disruptor, a sort of native dramaturg. The embodied mind that always but not deterministically informs our empathetic as well as prejudiced spectating, understanding and making of theatres, what Gadamer characterises as our necessary pre or for judgment. The acknowledgement that such discussion and openness rests on admitting what we do not know, on being returned to our personal archives, on realising the new not new as we rework and recycle. Perhaps the strength of the Italian philosopher Svatimo's idea of weak thought. Weak and strong, weak, strong, strong, weak. I like that. And of course, just to remind us of the two Beckett quotes that bookend the volume. The sun shone, having no alternative on a nothing new. And going many pages on, if I can find it. Page 239. Ham, it's the end of the day like any other day, isn't it, Clove? Clove, looks like it. Ham. The end is in the beginning, and yet you go on. Thank you.
So, John, there's so many interesting provocations from this book, and I wonder. I'm assuming that Knut is still unfortunately not with us. Obviously, we got an international link, and that could be the reason. Maybe there's some problem. But in the meantime, John, if you can just tell us a little bit about the type of so this publication, Staging and Recycling, revisits previous essays and new work that you and Knut have written, and again using also contextualized and further provoked, we could say, by other readings. So if you can tell us a little bit about this process. Where did this book come from as an idea, and also what was the experience in doing it?
It actually grew out of the experience of doing the PhD by prior publication. And I see my colleague Simon sitting there, so he's familiar with this, whereby you have to reflect on your own work. It's incredibly difficult because, of course, one's PhD supervisor, the rubric, doesn't allow you simply to repeat what you've said. Of course not. You have to find ways of reflecting on it, of reapproaching it. And so in some respects, that was the kind of seed of this. And having completed that successfully, the idea of the experience of having re-looked at what clearly was, I could start to say, my own archive. In other words, publications going back to 1996, the book on physical theatres and so on, so a number of journal publications and so on. It kind of made me realise what is required, the discipline, almost the playing with looking at one's own work in a way that doesn't simply reiterate, but actually reapproaches. And so, of course, from that comes the prefix re, re. What on earth does that mean? Well, we kind of play with that in the volume. And I suppose the second part of that is knowing, in this case, knowing Knut, again, since the mid-90s, having worked together in Bergen and elsewhere, Kaunas in Lithuania. Again, kind of thinking, what do we share? What do we have that we can look back on with our shared experiences, teaching together, so on, extraordinary conversations over pints of beer in various pubs and bars in Bergen, London and everywhere else, and so on, doing conference papers together, etc. And so again, this idea then of a dialogue. So we put RE together, dialogue together, with the stuff that we had both produced, i.e. published. And then, of course, one has one's unpublished work, conference papers that have been delivered and, of course, disappeared. Once you've delivered them, they're gone. They're out there. That's it, unless they're captured in a publication in some way. And so that's rather a shame. They got lost somewhere. They kind of disappeared. Well, how do we rescue them? And so it gradually comes together of previous experience, previous sharing, liaison, working together, thinking about, in inverted commas, lost work, which of course is not lost. How can we play with this as a project? And that's where it started from. And our wonderful editor, Ben, at Routledge, took the proposal and said, there's something not quite right, so it's missing. What's missing? What's missing? And we sort of thinking, haha, we need people to critique our work. We need people to reflect on what we've done, not just us reflecting on it. Hence our invitation to our guest contributors who did fabulous essays, simply being asked to respond to the themes of the book, to respond to our previous work, published and unpublished, to constructively criticize or have a constructively critical response to those themes and ideas. And we more or less gave you guys carte blanche, really, to write what you wanted within the parameters. And so we have this fantastic multi-dialectic going on, this multi-dialogue going on, that traces ideas back to the 1990s, as far as I'm concerned, and yet are still relevant. So the archive is live. The archive is nothing dead. It's still an alive thing.
And John, the idea of and later on we're going to it'd be really great if we could hear some of the contributors, and I'm very happy to start to get people sort of warmed up. But it'd be really great to hear more from the contributors' perspectives to this. Before we do that, the idea of archive is so central to your research and to this particular publication, and of course the idea of archiving has become increasingly an important question in generally in art studies and in general scholarship, with this idea that we need to think of archives no longer simply as static records of things, but as a way of interrogating a dynamic system that can continue to be relevant through a sort of self or dialectical interrogation. So and it strikes me yesterday, just to give a bit more context, yesterday with John and Giancarlo Rossi, he's the co-author of the chapter that we've contributed to this publication. We had a session with our performance students on our BA program, and we talked about this, and it was really interesting how performance students respond to this idea, and about this kind of reconciling the idea of using previous experience through ourselves as a personal archive, and then this need to, of course, feel that your work has to be original. So on the one hand, you realize that you're taken back into your own work, into your own life experience, and equally you're searching for something new. And John, you shared some really interesting thoughts on that concept yesterday. Can we just maybe re-extrapolate some of those ideas, starting from the archive, and then how does it compare to those ideas?
I think I've really kind of touched on this already. I suppose another insight, and it's almost banal. I mean, like many of these things are. Once you realise it, you think it's so obvious. It's almost banal. We think of the archive as the library in our institution and whatever. And I, of course, working on this, and again, this came, I think, from the PhD experience of, well, of course, we have our own personal archive. And as I said yesterday, I can remember one of the very first performances. Actually, I can remember even further back, but I won't embarrass myself. But I can still remember a performance I saw of Midsummer Night's Dream that was performed by a local amateur dramatic company at our local college in the town I grew up in. That would have been about 1971, so a couple of years before I went to college as a mature student. And I still have an image of that. I'm sure it's slightly coloured. I'm sure it's not totally accurate. The point being, it's an image that I can still have. I can still see the site in a way. And I'm thinking, my gosh, that's my archive. And I can remember so many productions that I've seen, as I'm sure many of us can, over the years. And how have those things stayed with me? How have they influenced me? How do they creep into what I'm doing? Not just as nostalgia, not just as me telling anecdotes to students and boring the pants off them, but actually as a living archive, as something which is meaningful to me and meaningful in that it informs my work. And I suspect that's true for all of us. In fact, I know it is. I know that it's true for all of us. We have our own archive. And therefore, the archive is those experiences, not just the books and the objects that we may be able to pull off the shelf and so on. It's the experiences that we draw on. And I think it's both that simple, Jacek, and that rich. And I'm not really sure I can say more than that, because that's really where it came from. And so the comes into this, going revisiting the archive. That's really what it is, re-looking. And that the whole richness of that term doing something with something again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, John, when you mentioned that these examples, another example comes to my mind that I was thinking about it since yesterday, was when I was little, in my school, I was brought up in Italy and just outside of Rome, and we visited in a school. There was this theatre company that was using the space to rehearse. And I think I probably was 8 or 9 years old, and our teacher told us that if we were really quiet, we could go and just see what this company was rehearsing. And they were using this whole gym to rehearse this piece. And I remember seeing people doing what now I think, looking back, it was probably a sort of physical theatre piece with some singing, sort of operatic, contemporary, something, very, very avant-garde for the school that I was in, which was a religious school, quite conservative environment. And to this day, I often think that's probably the piece that made me think at the time, oh, I really want to do theatre. But it's interesting because I don't know whether it was a great thing or whether it was possibly a really bad thing. And just in my memory, it was been archived as being something so powerful, which sort of leads us to the next section. So at this point, I would love to call in contributors to the book, and I know we're keeping this session, as you can see, unusually spontaneous, but that was part of the idea, because we with this book being so much a dialogue-based publication, we wanted to make this event to keep that essence rather than having simply a sort of static PowerPoint presentation of the book. So perhaps I'll start as a contributor. I'd love to speak also for my colleague Giancarlo Rossi, who unfortunately cannot be here today, and he co-wrote the chapter that we contributed to this book, which is called Recycle, Upcycle. The interesting point that John mentions about the hyphen, and it was, I must say that initially it probably was completely, so we simply wrote recycle without a hyphen, and then as we went on, we started to add the hyphen, and of course, as John points out, that became meaningful in the subject of the piece. I'll give a really quick overview or that chapter, and it's when John invited us to write something for the book. We were debating with John quite a bit on how to do it. So what type of responses would each of us come up with, and then eventually we thought, oh, actually, let's suggest to John whether we can actually do a piece that is a dialogue. And so John was again both John and Knut very open-minded to this, which was a brilliant thing from a writer's point of view, from a contributor's point of view there, and so we decided to be inspired by the way that Knut and John write, which was with this sense of very dynamic conversation, and that's when we decided to try and reprise that, so that we would write on the subject of recycling, drawing on John and Knut's ideas of what is the recycle, but also particularly we start from the provocation of what the word recycling means in everyday in everyday language nowadays, in terms of how most people might see the connotation of that word. And of course we thought of the environment as a starting point, and the idea of recycling, and mixing that with the idea of when you create performance and you produce material, you also produce stuff, you produce props, you produce costumes. What happens to those to that material, and how, and literally starting from the environmental point of view of storing things, of adding more stuff on a world that's choking out of stuff to some extent, metaphorically and physically. So we started to debate on this idea, and then the chapter then moves on to a journey through self-reflection on projects that both Jan worked on, particularly to do with the Shakespeare Festival in Gdańsk in Poland, and myself from a project that I created for Tate Modern 2 years ago called In Limbo. And we basically reflect on those ideas of how much this idea of recycling, both physically in the way that one piece can incorporate other elements from previous stuff that we created, both physically and conceptually, and also how this idea then relates to this myth of originality. And it's an interesting one, originality, because to some extent we all question it. We all know it's a myth. You can never be completely original, and yet you look into how in artistic practice this concept is still very much a key criterion to measure new work. And of course, in a scholarly practice, we still, we are obviously, many of you will have come out of the ref cycle of the ref preparations, and of course, originality is still there as this sort of axiom that cannot be challenged. It has to be proven. And so that cannot be, yes, that has to be proven and can be challenged only in that sense. So that's kind of where we went with that chapter, and I'd love to hear more from other contributors. Could I have, if that's okay, and sorry to throw you straight into the debate, but could I have, if people could raise your hand if you've contributed to this, and so we can perhaps hear from you. And I wonder whether there can be, so I can see, you can also use, yes, brilliant, so you can use the button there. So we got Stephanie.
Should.
Brilliant, and we got, and that's brilliant, yeah, Richard, and let me just see 1 second. So. Brilliant. If I could hear, are we happy? Stephanie, would you be happy to start? So I'm not doing formal introduction, so please do feel free to just say a little bit about your background before you talk about your contribution. And thank you for this. Sorry to throw you in the deep end.
Okay. Hi everyone. I'm Stephanie Zagsmeier. I'm senior lecturer in theatre arts at Middlesex University, and usually my work sort of is looking at creative processes, done some work on collaboration and solidarity practices. So I'm quite interested in how performance extends in the socio-political sphere, but then I have sort of another strand of my work, which is not unrelated, and that's to do with the work of Rosemary Butcher, a British choreographer that I worked with quite intensely for the past decade of her life. She died in 2016, and so I contributed a small chapter, or is it an essay? I don't quite know. It's quite short, to this volume. The one with the pictures in it, so you can find it very quickly, and I find that very important. So here you go. That's an appeal for more images in that center around performance practice. But yeah, I just sort of thought about this idea of and also the timing of when this was written, and the timing and of when how it's published. And I feel like I'm even rereading my own, although I hate to reread. It's a bit funny, isn't it, to reread one's own once it's printed? You get sort of jerks of reactions. Did I write that? But yeah, I think it's this time of slowly coming out of COVID, and the world has changed. And so I feel, to me at least, this idea of has also has taken on a really urgent meaning right now. What do we, from my own title about retaining and reframing, as sort of, what do we retain from the world pre-COVID and pre-Brexit and so many things? And how do we reframe things? And this idea of of course, deals with this sense of returning to a previous state, but also has this idea of once more afresh and anew. And I'm looking at this definition that I copied out of the Oxford Dictionary and included in the chapter as well. So I think there's a bit of an urgency also about, how do we go about that process of looking back and reassessing as we go along. In terms of my own chapter, I mean, this was looking at a piece or a couple of pieces of Rosemary Butcher, her latest pieces that she performed in 2015 mainly. And what was interesting to me in witnessing her work and her working, her creative process, was that she didn't sort of redo something. She was very quiet, and only in private conversations told me that she picked up ideas that she'd been working with sort of 30 years earlier, 20 to 30 years. And she never sort of communicated that in any program notes. But what she did with her dancers, she got her dancers to work and look at ruins, so physical remnants and remains. So in some ways, she shared a conversation around ruins and this idea of decay and what remains. Looking at architecture, that was one of her real, she had very passionate interest in architecture as well as the fine arts. So I'm quite still quite intrigued personally, very biased, in terms of that approach that she set up, sort of put something into the center of the conversation, something that they all looked at and could experience in the moment, rather than telling them, oh, here was my original work, let me show it to you. It wasn't, it sort of looked at something that was a remnant of the past in terms of the physical structure. And so, yeah, the work was built around that. She also picked up some of the language she used in the past, but really used it in the moment. So it probably took on, very different meanings to 20 or 30 years ago. So yeah, that's my little very ad hoc.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And of course,
you wanted a contribution from us, but that's fine. Here I am.
This is part of the improvisation of we're sort of recycling, improvising. This is a new method we're doing. And of course, Stephanie, your chapter on Rosemary Butcher is really interesting in that respect, and of course it really makes shows the interdisciplinarity that's at the core of the whole anthology. So it's really interesting. We'll come back also to that point about how COVID has affected our perception. I'd love to hear also, maybe perhaps from the rest of our members today. And before we do that, thank you very much, Stephanie. If we again, impromptu contribution, and thank you for jumping in. Do we have Andre Eiermann? Are you happy to talk?
Hello.
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 Yeah, I'm completely unprepared, of course, but
I was too,
Aren't
by
we
the way.
Aren't we all?
yes, nice to see you all. Yeah, about me, I'm a theater scholar and dramaturg and yeah, performing artist in some cases. From Germany, but now living in Norway, working in Kristiansand at the University of Agder. And I chose to write about a practical project I did with bachelor students here. So like my biography is anyways both on the theoretical and on the practical side. I have studied applied theater studies in Gießen, Germany, which is a 50-50 theoretical practical studies. So I chose this practical project, which was a site-specific project in form of a guided tour where the audience was guided through a theater building and through the area surrounding this theater building, where a big corn silo, an old corn silo, is at the moment renovated and shall become a super museum, very representative building for a huge collection of a hedge fund manager based in London, but originally from Kristiansand. And this whole process was a very controversial thing in Kristiansand, and in actually, yeah, it was a topic in whole Norway. So what we did in this case was, like, if I should talk about the archive, we referred to the public debate, and from newspaper articles to discussions and all the texts that came up in this debate, and used this as our archive and material to work with. And so the idea was actually to bring this debate back into the area which it is talking about. And by this we actually applied a strategy which we know from the Situationists, détournement. So we used this text and recycled them by also changing them a bit. For example, we used a text about a kind of a city part which is also built there in this area, which is a very prestigious project, and it was a kind of advertising text about this city part, and we exchanged some terms and didn't speak about buildings but about stages, or so that it could be understood as a text about our performance, a kind of meta text about the performance. So we actually applied this situation strategy of détournement, which in itself is a kind of recycling, but of course a kind of subversive recycling. And at the same time, it was a way to bring the students in contact with both these texts from stemming from the debate, but we also used theoretical texts like Inside the White Cube, or texts about institutional critique, and kind of connect these texts in the process and related them to this area, to the buildings and to the building processes there. And we also worked with this strategy on a visual level by, for example, sampling or recycling the architectural structure of the silo in form of cardboard tubes, which we used as props, which then appeared from several places on this tour. So that was the project I took as a point of departure for writing this article, and going then a bit deeper into this situationist concept of détournement, and also the opposite concept of recuperation, which is interesting also with regards to the museum, because this collection which shall be exhibited there also contains, in fact, situationist works, namely works by Asger Jorn. So it's a kind of example of recuperation. And so situationism was the historical reference for the article, and at the same time the question how to recycle these strategies today in an era where situationism from some point of view is considered as out of date. That's so.
Sure,
Thank
and
you.
it's really interesting, Andrea. Also, in your reference to situationism, this idea of the subversive recycling is a really interesting concept. I'm conscious of time, so we and I know that John, by the way, that Knut has been trying to connect with us. So John, if I'm going to pass on the word to Richard, if that's okay with you. And again, I'm doing this completely from that. Thank you again so much. John, if you could have a look on your email, because I think Knut has sent us a text that if you could read that at the end, that would be really great. Because for some reason he hasn't been able to connect. Richard Cummings, so if I can ask you for your to tell us a little bit about your contribution.
Yes, okay, fine. Thanks very much for putting me on the spot. Yeah, I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Performing Arts at the University of Winchester. And really, I come from a clown practitioner background many years ago, starting on Brighton Beach, actually, with Jonathan Kay and Attic Theatre, way back. Yes, so I was a performer for quite a few years before becoming a so-called academic, and so I've been very interested throughout both my performing kind of career, if that's what we can call it, in the whole how do we keep archives, because of course we used to improvise shows and then we'd rehearse them, but there was no kind of the documentation was very scarce, and in my PhD I write a bit about this, in that all that's left of some things is a list which we knew what we were doing, so it says Pin on the Chair, which was a clown piece, an entree that we created, but that's all it is, and could we recreate it, and so on. And I have been, so my contribution was actually in the form of a letter, because I'm also interested in the way that practitioners write. And in my PhD, which is about clowns and institutions and how we play and work inside institutions, I was trying to write at certain times as a clown. How would a clown, if a clown were to write a PhD, how would a clown write a PhD? So I'm interested. And basically I responded to John writing a lot about Samuel Beckett, which has always been an interest of mine. But Knut, when he writes about avant-garde work and Dada, by writing a letter, so a letter on recycling Sam, where I imagine I'm writing to Knut and John about Beckett, and a clown called Vladimir Olshansky, a Russian clown, who to me seems to be in a mode of clowning that is very Beckettian. But also to Knut about what I would call an avant-garde Dadaist clown who won the Comedy Award at Edinburgh a few years ago. He's an American called Dr. Brown. Really interesting, very anarchic, and the way he uses the audience, which is quite extraordinary, in terms of participation. Standard participation, he goes way beyond that, almost leaving the stage at the end, so that and the audience are just having a kind of carnivalesque party by then. He's got us so involved, but he does it in a very playful, clown-like way that gradually builds up until you go, yeah, I'll do what you want. I'll dance, I'll be over in this corner, and so on. Yes, I wrote it as but I'm also intrigued by audience and the way that audiences responding to Rancière. But so I wrote this and I sent it to John, actually, and it was John who said to me, well, I think, Richard, you can go a bit further in your writing, you know, be a bit bolder, don't be so tentative, writing dear John and Knut, and then writing an academic essay, yours sincerely, just write it as though you're writing a chatty essay. And it kind of freed me up to play around with writing. Sorry, I might be going on a bit too long. But I'm also very interested in the whole archive, particularly as I'm writing another chapter for a book on the alternative comedy movement way back starting in the early 1980s, of which there really is very, very little archive material. Really little, because I'm writing about the cabaret scene here in Winchester. I've contacted people, spoken to people, and lots of them are saying, well, I can't remember. I simply can't remember. So I'm integrating that into the chapter, this fact that there's memory, and where does memory meet with archive, which I also think, you know, is a key, well, not necessarily archive, but a key, you know, trope in Beckett, the whole idea of memory and fading memory and what we lose and what we can't remember. So that's me.
Thank you so much, and the you know, these different contributions, I mean, really testify how again interdisciplinary. So we go again from you know, we've talked about Shakespeare, from Shakespeare to Beckett to Rosemary Butcher to situationism to clown practice and alternative comedy, and it's interesting because going back to that point, John, that you were saying before, that and I think Stephanie mentioned that sometimes it's again part of this recycling idea is also to revisit the book. So my immediate you know, now drive is I want to reread the book, because to rediscover these other elements. And I know that I think that there are other contributors, but I'm a little bit conscious of time, because I know that also John has received a message from Knut. And John, perhaps do you want to read that, and if that's okay?
Sure. Just very quickly, I think it's fine. I mean, this whole thing about recycling, I mean, I'm seeing here people I've known for so long. I've worked with Richard, I've worked with Stephanie. We've known each other for so long. Richard and I go back to the physical theatre, as does Simon, who was with us a little while back and might still be there. It's extraordinary. So this whole thing of what's kind of going around, and it's not just about nostalgia. It's actually about, there's something active, there's something very dynamic, something very live. That might rise and fall, but it's there nevertheless. You know, and I have to just comment on this. The notion of I loved Richard's title, "Recycling Sam." I mean, how do you recycle a writer whose work is so bounded, yet who recycles his own themes within? Yeah, I mean, that's what's so fantastic about Beckett. I mean, the guy is just amazing. Yeah, so we have a letter here from Knut, as we might say, and apologising. He's having problems getting onto Teams, and the system is not working for him. However, so I'll read this out. How did this book come about? The short answer is that it was born through a series of meetings many years back in time, be it in Kaunas in 1996, when John was sitting outside his studio in the courtyard of the Vytautas Magnus University guest house in the customs street of the old city of Kaunas. I had another studio on the same courtyard. My eyes got caught on a book on landscapes, and I guess it started there. We were both teaching in the Theatrology Institute of the Faculty of Arts, to which that is Knut, has returned many times to come, as have I, a few times. But John and I started to meet in London, drinking coffee in Kensington Gardens Pavilion at the bottom of the Serpentine Lake, taking a walk up the Serpentine Gallery to visit the bookshop, go to a pub, Finally, we'd go and have fish and chips in Knightsbridge, and little by little, our discussions revolving around cultural exchange, Britain, Scandinavia. We've gone on the South Bank talking about details of a book that had been accepted by Routledge. I should add to this, I've been to Bergen a number of times, as I say, to work with Knut. What happened in the meantime? Well, that is what you can read about in the introduction to the book, which I refer to a little here. In Staging and Recycling, John and Knut revisit and reappraise the selection of their work to explore how the retrieval, reapproaching and reframing of material can open pathways for new work and new thinking. So I need to, that's better. And more. The project has a number of aims to suggest how the status of new with regard to the academic and stage dramaturgical materials may be reframed, to re-examine these through certain lenses and concepts, recycling, reworking the spectator, landscape, post and other dramaturgies, to explore the possibilities of critique. So there it is, critique, both in practice and academically. It has to do with a direct and pragmatic approach to ways of understanding theatre and drama with regard to dramaturgies and aesthetic approaches. So I say to myself, this came out of meetings. It all came out of meetings in guest house courtyards, galleries around London, John coming to Bergen or festivals, Knut visiting London, John being there for the Norwegian Theatre Academy in Fredrikstad, and also, guess what? A seminar on recycling. And the rest is too embarrassing for me to read out, so I refuse to read this out. But I will say thank you to all the other contributors for joining us.
Brilliant.
And myself by reading out.
Now we want to know. Stephanie before was talking about the implication of how these words may have taken yet another connotation due to COVID, and at some point, Richard, you mentioned about the interaction with the public, and of course now that spontaneity is one of the things that of course we inevitably in performance we're all a bit conscious of, how much of that spontaneity for the foreseeable future can will have to be always somehow restricted by the current situation. I'm wondering whether there's anybody, and this I'm now opening completely to the audience also for any question. We've got very few, literally a couple of minutes, but if there's any thought about these themes in the present situation, or simply a question that people might have on the book or what you've heard today. Yes, Stephen, thank you. Oh, Stephen, you're muted.
Hello, John, from across the Atlantic and everyone else. Yes,
Yeah.
I'm wondering what, in terms of our personal archive in the form of memories, Alfred Adler says, contemporary of Freud, says that memory is not about the past at all, it's about the present, and that we recreate our memories every time we draw them out. Our mind is not a computer with files in it. And as we change, our memories change, our personal archive changes. And in fact, that's one of the signs that someone is making progress in psychotherapy. So I'm wondering if anyone has a comment on that on the archive is actually about the present.
Good point. Thank you so much. John, I'll leave it to you.
Stephen knows me well enough he knows I'm going to say it's both, which I think it is. I think it's a lovely citing of Adler there, Stephen. And as I acknowledged when I talked back to this theatre performance that I remember from roughly 1970-71, I'm sure there's some false memory involved. I'm slightly misremembering, of course. And so therefore, when I remember it, I'm slightly recreating. But I don't think there's anything false about that, because I can only say, believe me, when I can actually see, I have a slightly blurred image of the site where that thing was performed, just as I can still see in my mind's eye, in my memory, images of various settings of productions I've seen over the years, and I can still see them somehow. So I suppose I think it's both. We kind of recreate, we perhaps slightly, we embellish, certainly people embellish their memories. Of course, we all do that, particularly when you are being nostalgic with your friends after about 6 pints of beer and the nostalgia, or a few whiskies in our case, and the nostalgia becomes ever more. But what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that, but let's leave that to one side. So we kind of remember and misremember, we remember, recreate, but I believe that fundamentally there's an accuracy about what we are remembering from that archive. There is something truthful about that. It's not just a recreation, and it's not therefore just about the present. I think it's that movement between past and present, which is dynamic. And I'm afraid I do come back to certain terms in the last 60 minutes I've been overusing perhaps, but it is about dynamic. Are you in a dialectical relationship with yourself? Okay, now I know you can talk about Gestalt and we can go on and on and on about something else, but I prefer to stick to terms that I'm more comfortable with. So a dialectic with myself, yeah, maybe. I think that's as I said already, I'm seeing faces on the screen here, and I remember back to things with Stephanie, things with Richard, things with yourself, Stephen, and so on and so forth. That's very present. It's very live, and I think that's the important thing for me.
And on that note, and I think, looking back, by the way, the fact that Knut couldn't unfortunately join us for this session, but the fact that he sent his statement and that we have captured from the statement, I mean, that in itself is an interesting issue of archiving. And Stephen's point, really, really interesting, the relationship between the archive and the present. So we've run out of time. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us today, and I'm so pleased that we kept this session as dynamic as the book intends it to be. It would have seemed to not to do the right justice to the book, but to simply again go through some slides about what the content of it. If I have missed some contributors, I'm really sorry about that, but absolutely, so I welcome everybody, to really invite everybody to read the book, to order it for your institution, and and I'm just going to reread it because I just want to immerse myself in this. One last point, we've got more talks coming up in the next Thursdays. It's always on a Thursday, and the talks are always either by Creature or by Cube, so the two research centers. If you have a look on our respective websites, or on simply just by googling AAD talks, AAD sessions. I should get it right. I will get it right one day. You'll see more information on that. So please do book for those. And otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a nice day. Bye bye.